different native peoples that you've worked with over the years, and they've all talked to you about their lives, their traditions, and probably they've talked to you about the times in which we live. Many of them, I'm sure, are aware of the times in which we live. I had conversations with the Karo elders in the mid-90s where they were talking about the upturning of the universe, the universe getting turned inside out, but this would also be a time of great broadening of awareness of humanity. It would also be a very difficult time. It seems spot on, the way things are moving right now. But you've worked with so many different peoples, and I'm sure that they've all had a strain of hope in their conversation with you. So maybe we can just do a bit of a move around the world here, and perhaps you could give us some advice from their elders. What kind of hope do they see, who are in an even more difficult situation, I think, than we are in right now, and see if we can help people out with some of their ancient cultural artifacts in their expression to you. Maybe
well, you know, the thing that I notice so often is that indigenous people, when they become aware of these changes, they feel a personal responsibility, and this is one of the great tragedies. I mean, for example, you know, when people in the Himalaya or in the Andes who believe the earth is alive, believe in mountain deities, if things go askew, they take it very personally. I mean, one of the most kind of poignant examples of that is what you experienced at the Coyariti. I mean, traditionally, of course, the Coyariti is this syncretic fusion of pre-Columbian and Catholic ideas, a perfect expression of this pan-Andean world, which you know, is as influenced by Catholicism as it is by pre-Columbian Incaic and pre-Incaic ideas. But pilgrimage becomes a sacred movement to the ice, so that this wonderful metaphor of taking the crosses from your community, placing them into the tongues of the glacier that comes down over the Sinicara Valley, leaving them overnight to empower them that you can take it back to your community. But remember as well that traditionally you also brought chunks of ice back to your community, and they've stopped doing that because they're witnessing the recession of the glaciers, and they take it as their own personal responsibility and fault. And that's very moving, because of course the trivial amount of ice that was chipped from those glaciers and brought home as the essence of Pachamama to those who couldn't participate in the pilgrimage is trivial compared to what of course is really happening, is this recession of the glaciers. By the same token, I recently was returned to the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, where you have this extraordinary group of related peoples, the Wiwa, the Kohi, and the Arhuacos, all descendants of the Tairona civilization, which once carpeted the Caribbean coastal plain, all perceiving themselves as being the elder brothers, the ones responsible for the maintenance of the well-being of the world. And clearly in the wake of the conquest, you know, they retreated into this isolated volcanic massif that soars to 20,000 feet over the coastal plain of Colombia. And in a kind of blood-stained continent, in many ways you could argue these people have never been fully conquered by the Spanish. I mean, they remain ruled by a ritual priesthood, and in fact they've created or maintained or recreated a kind of Baroque religiosity, which is astonishing. I mean, some people feel that the religious view of the people of the Sierra is derived from the moment of the Holocaust at the time of contact. In other words, when the diseases swept through and the Spaniards unleashed their terror, it's like the people somehow retreated in the mountains and said, my God, we really blew it. Otherwise this wouldn't have happened to us. We'll never blow it again. We'll never forget the obligations we have to the Great Mother. But however this came about, to this day, you know, living 2 hours from Miami Beach by modern jet, the people of the Sierra Nevada literally are praying for your well-being. I mean, they believe that their ritual activities and their literal prayers maintain the cosmic balance of the earth. They call themselves the Elder Brothers, charged with the obligation to maintain the heart of the world, which is the Sierra, and charged with the duty to inform us, the younger brother, of the foolishness of our ways. And I find this incredibly moving that so close to Miami and the eastern seaboard, 500 years after Columbus, is this remarkably intact tradition. A people for whom the loom is a metaphor of life. Upon this loom I weave my life. They respond, they describe their movements up and down the ecological flank of the gradient of the Sierra as threads. They plant fields so that the women plant it like this and the men plant it like this, so that if you turn it on its side you have a piece of cloth. Mm-hmm. They have a ritual training for the priesthood which is extraordinary in its intensity. The young acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3 and essentially kept in the environs of the men's sacred temple for 18 years. 2 9-year periods deliberately chosen to mimic the 9 months of gestation of their natural mother's womb. Now they're metaphorically in the womb of the Great Mother, and for that entire time the world in a sense only exists as an abstraction as they're taught the values of their society, values that maintain this amazing idea that their prayers maintain the cosmic balance. And then after this long period of initiation, the young priest-to-be is taken on pilgrimage from the sea to the ice to exchange materials from sea to ice to sea. But during that time, he really sees the world as it is for the first time. Mm. And what has existed as only an abstraction is suddenly revealed in stunning beauty. And the priest effectively says to him, you see, as I've told you all these years, it's yours to protect. You are the elder brother. And that's just an astonishing thing. And I've seen in a more tragic sense even, that look of incredulity on the faces of people like the Penan in the forests of Sarawak in Borneo. I remember, the Penan were one of the last truly nomadic peoples of the rainforests of Southeast Asia. And in the year of my birth, there were probably, 50 to 60,000 nomadic Penan living in a remarkable way of life. I mean, nomadic people, first of all, are an echo of what we all once were, as your film suggests, before the Neolithic Revolution, we were all wanderers on a pristine planet. Nomadic societies are profoundly different. How do you measure wealth in a society in which everything can be made from the forest, in which there are really no specialists, and in which ultimately, at least at some point in time, everything has to be carried on your back, so there's no incentive to create material collections? Well, the measure of wealth is consciously said to be the strength of social relations between people, because if those relations fray, everybody suffers. By the same token, in a nomadic society, sharing becomes an involuntary reflex, because you never know who will be the next to bring the food to the table, as it were. And I remember sitting in the edge of the forest with a very close friend of mine, Asik Nialik, and he was a hunter, and we suddenly the moon appeared through this sort of clouded sky, and he looked up to the moon, and he looked to me, and he looked back to the moon, and he says, "The true your people really went there?" And I said, "Yeah, we did go there." And he said, "Well, what kind of canoe or transport did they have? How long did it take to get there? Mm-hmm. And is it true that you only brought back rock and dust?" Mm-hmm. And it was hard to explain to a man who kindled fire with flint a space program that had consumed the wealth of nations and catapulted a dozen men collectively, I don't know how many billion miles across space to the moon, and that they in fact only did bring back rock and dust, 828 pounds altogether. And yet there was this kind of look in Asik's face like, well, why did you do all that? And yet here you are in my forest, as we were, in the guise of Korean and Japanese and Chinese timber companies, literally cutting the life out from beneath the feet of these people. And he just couldn't understand it. I mean, why would you want to do this? why would you want the glare of the hot sun when you could have the comfort of the canopy of the forest? Why would you possibly want, to, rip into the heart of the planet with these roads that just muddy our rivers that you can't fish? I mean, he just couldn't believe it, that how people could be so stupid and so vain. And, it's the same thing when you go up to the high Arctic. I recently was in Qaanaaq in northwest Greenland, which is one of the most northern, most inhabited places on the planet. And, here you are, a remarkable people, the Inuit, who have had to endure so much, both in Greenland, but especially in polar Canada. They've had to endure within virtually a generation, because many of these communities were scarcely contacted until the Second World War. And they've had to endure the diseases, the missionaries, the culture of poverty, the residential schools, the imposition of new technologies, and and all that they've had to deal with. And yet still they remain strong. And you have gestures like the creation by Canada of Nunavut, the new territory, which is such an amazing sort of gesture of restitution on the part of a nation state. And in places like Qaanaaq, where the people really have discovered, in particularly there, a way of fusing the traditional and the modern. They live in nice houses, they have good clinics, they use cell phones, they've all got DVDs, they're all plugged into Denmark and European society, but they kept their dogs. They don't allow skidoos, snowmobiles, to be used in daily life, because they knew that the dogs represented the cultural pivot, and that as long as they continued to use dogs, the act of maintaining the dogs, training the dogs, hunting with the dogs, would essentially keep something of their essence, indeed all of their essence, alive into the 21st century. And so it's a remarkable example of perseverance and cultural survival, and yet now, having endured so much, they are suffering from something far beyond their capacity to control: global climate change. The ice upon which all the marine life, mammal life in particular, depends, and therefore all humans depend, used to come in September and stay till the end of July. Now it comes in November and is gone by March. So they've seen the entire kind of economic and ecological foundation of their hunting way of life. Literally, it's dissolved beneath them because of climate change. And so, again, you go out with these folks, and I remember, in particular, flying from Igloolik in a charter plane across Baffin Island with a friend of mine who was a hunter from Igloolik, who had taken his dog team up Ellesmere Island, across Baffin Island, up Ellesmere, and across over to Greenland to visit distant relatives. And as we flew across the Kane Basin between Ellesmere and northern Greenland, he looked out the plane and he just started to weep. He just couldn't believe how everything was melted, how he would never again be able to take his dogs and his sled across that route that people had traveled, and that he in his courage had traveled as recently as 20 years ago. And tears were just sort of coming down on his cheek as we looked out at this scene. And so wherever I've gone, the people are just incredulous that we have allowed this to happen on the planet. And at the same time, they sometimes feel very helpless to do much about it.
Would you say that all of these people shared the Peruvian idea of Aini? Is that really fundamental to their belief system?
A community?
That we have this reciprocal relationship with the living earth?
I think it, like all things, human cultures are complicated and they're different, and they express things in different ways. People's attitude towards landscape and nature changes, depending on the place. But I think that in general, it's fair to say, whereas some people have a very clear and conscious idea of the earth, some people just live within the earth, within the process of being on the earth, and these ideas are never forgotten but rarely spoken about. it's tricky when we speak of indigenous people, and we sort of either inadvertently still invoke the old canard of Rousseau and the noble savage as if the people are somehow genetically closer to the earth than we can be, or we invoke Henry David Thoreau and suggest that because of their sensitivity they're more contemplative than we could ever be. In a way, both ideas are almost silly in their simplicity. Indigenous people are just like any other people, confronted by the same challenges. And they have, however, through time and ritual, created a kind of traditional mystique of the earth that's based not on the idea of being self-consciously aware of your place on it, but in many ways a far more subtle intuition, and that is the idea, particularly exemplified in places like Australia, that the earth itself only exists because it's filtered through the human imagination. This is where it really comes from. In other words, you can't possibly, how do you possibly create an idea of an ability to destroy the planet if you lack the technology to do so? I mean, I remember living, for example, with the Guarani in eastern Ecuador, and a wonderful moment when a guy was chopping down, a great forest tree, taking enormous delight in doing so. And suddenly he burst into pride and he said, "And once I killed a jaguar just from me to you." And then he went back to chopping. And you could tell that cutting down the forest and killing jaguars were like the cat's meow to him. But of course, this was a man who, in his childhood, was of a people that still cut down the forest by pounding the cambial layer with stone axes. So, how would you expect the Guarani, for example, to develop an ethos of conservation when for all of their history they didn't have the tools to even begin to impact the natural world? So it changes culture to culture, but what I do see is that in ritual and in gesture, people are very often living with this idea that they're not just close to the earth, they're intricately connected to the earth because the earth only exists because of the human imagination. That doesn't mean that people can't be capable of blindness. I mean, one of the great horrors of the world is the toxicity of the mother of Ganges, and how in modern times people are prepared to, in certain cases, become so obsessed with the sanctity of a site that the site remains sacred no matter how defiled it becomes by us. And certainly, one of the great tragedies, or one of the great horrors in Australia, is the living conditions of Aboriginal people who live in communities. I mean, those communities make almost the worst Canadian or American native reserve, dreadful as these places can be, in terms of social pathology and living conditions. And one of the great points of shame is the way that native people have been corralled into these places. But at any rate, the conditions in Australia are far worse, and there's a level of kind of degradation and living in a kind of squalor that is really demoralizing to the people, I think, and but so it's not, which obviously is part of the clash of culture there. But so it's not like people necessarily, and the kind of Thoreauian idea of native people almost becomes racist in its simplicity, because it implies that these people, quote unquote, these people, are fundamentally different than us. And in many ways, I would argue that in essence, human beings are remarkably similar. It's just that our worldview became a kind of extreme tangent of human possibilities, the consequences of which have been both sublime and catastrophic. And what we need to do is get a little bit more of the sublime and a little bit less of the catastrophic.
Are the plants helping us to do that? This whole movement of ayahuasca through the world with Santo Daime, the kind of shamanic revival in the West, I suppose. Well, is it helping?
Well, I'm someone who loves to be able to say that not only did I inhale, I enjoyed it. In other words, one of the things that I find so interesting about our generation is not that we became the most kind of self-referential and narcissistic in history, not to mention the most materialistic. That was certainly a surprise to me. But when we look back on the recipe of social change that provokes some of these remarkable shifts, the role of women, attitudes toward people of color, the breakdown of racism, attitudes towards the environment, which are really quite extraordinary. The one ingredient that is consistently expunged from the record is the fact that millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having consumed some sacred plant. And I like to say that I don't honestly think that I would write the way I write. I would think the way I think. I don't think I would have the same appreciation of notions of cultural relativism that have obviously informed me as an anthropologist had I not taken San Pedro cactus or ayahuasca or the psychotropic substances. I mean, the big anti-drug people love to say, don't take these things, they're going to change your life. And they're right. That's the point of taking them. I mean, these things make you think in different ways. And, it reminds me of when the Beatles broke and, this friend of mine's father, couldn't understand the whole thing. And he just sort of said to me in a rage one day, bet they can't catch a football. And I thought, well, maybe true. But when I heard the first notes of Day into Life, I thought, wow, here's what words can do. And that's why I became a writer. This said, I'm not in any way advocating people to take psychotropic plants. And I think you want to be very careful to remember that wonderful adage of I think it was Ram Dass who said, get the message, hang up. What psychotropic plants have to teach us, I think, frankly, can be learned in a few sessions, and then I don't think you learn a whole lot more. And I think they're pharmacologically they're incredibly benign, but psychologically they can be challenging. And I think that it's an interesting thing where at a certain point in your life, when you're trying to deconstruct the universe, it's very useful to take these substances. But then when you start reconstructing your reality, sometimes they can be profoundly threatening. Now, the idea that I think I'll stop in a sec. So I'll just wait till it. Actually, I'll just shut this.
Well, that's kind of a good place to start.
Yeah.
We arrived in Washington on the very day that the bailout failed, and we were astonished at the feeling of peace and order and tranquility that permeated the whole downtown area. People imagine Washington, some people will think it's the center of the evil empire, but when you get there, it's so quiet and ordered. And I got the instant image of this is the center of the hurricane. We're right in the center of the hurricane.
Yeah, I mean, and you discover how little control any one individual has of events. I mean, the unraveling of the financial markets, all based on this invention of a couple of grad students from MIT in the early 90s. I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, a lot of people don't understand how, in a way, infinitely complex it is, but how simple in its essence. And its essence is simply the idea that mortgages and debt could be insured, so that you could take on more and more debt because you were paying some company to insure your debts so that the debts wouldn't default. So the more confident you were, the more debt you were willing to take on, and suddenly you had, these strange instruments being traded as commodities, which were nothing more or less than the presumption of responsibility for debt. But once you couldn't actually fulfill that responsibility, the whole system unraveled. So this idea that, for example, an insurance company would go into the business of insuring debt as opposed to insuring property or whatever. The problem is that if my house burns down, the insurance company's on the line for one house. But if that company is insuring massive arrays of debt, and the thing starts to unravel, the whole system sort of falls apart. And that seems to be what's happening. And it's it's kind of haunting that it's coming at the end of an administration that is not just a lame duck presidency, but is a dead duck presidency. You know, there's simply no moral capital remaining in what has been, in my opinion, for a very long time, a bankrupt administration.
Yeah, that's what's happening. And we don't want to make a disaster scenario movie. The reason it's called Earth Pilgrims is we want to, a lot of people are aware of what's happening and have been aware a long time, but there haven't been too many people who've come up with rays of light at the end of this tunnel who can put it in a perspective that allows us to see it as maybe something different, as a rite of passage. Maybe too grandiose to think of it as a transformation. I don't know.
Well, you know, we don't know where it's going to lay, where it's going to end up. But I mean, the point I've been trying to make, really, in all the work that I've done, is that this construct that we call the West, you know, the descendant of the Enlightenment, modern industrial, scientific, technologically driven culture, which we, in our hubris, and like all peoples, are sort of fiercely loyal to their own interpretations of reality, and most cultures are fiercely ethnocentric. We have this kind of conceit that this form of economic activity that we call modernity or whatever is somehow the real inexorable wave of history, and that these other ways of doing things, whether it's spiritual, cultural, economic, are somehow failed attempts at being us, failed attempts at being modern, you know, failed attempts to really be on the wave of history. And this is really the conceit that drives the whole development paradigm for so many years, is that, you know, we export a way of thinking about the economy as if it is inevitable, when in fact it's just a social construct. It's just one way of organizing economic and political activity. And the frightening thing is to realize that the depth of that way of being, or that way of thinking, is scarcely 300 years old. And that, in the scheme of things, is a pretty shallow history, and it shouldn't give us the confidence to assume that this is the only way of doing things. And the point that I'm always trying to make as an anthropologist, and I guess the whole profession of anthropology tries to make, is that these other peoples of the world don't represent failed attempts of being you or failed attempts of being modern, but that you represent unique answers to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when asked that question, they respond with obviously 6,000, 7,000 different voices, which collectively become a kind of human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that are going to confront us in the ensuing millennia. I mean, I've just come back from Australia, where I was making a film about the dreaming, the notion of the dream time. And, you know, it was really a revelation to me, because I had never been with, experienced a different cultural reality so profoundly, antithetically distinct from that of my own. You know, people speak often about people, say, in West Africa or Haiti or in Brazil or whatever, you know, moving on Brazilian time or Colombian time. It's always sort of a disparaging comment, you know. But the truth is that in the Aboriginal mind, there is no time. There is no word for time in the language. There is no concept of the linear progression of life. There is no sense of past, present, or future. In fact, those notions are completely incomprehensible to the Aboriginal individual, because they are in opposition to everything they have come to believe. And what you realize is that the Aboriginal trajectory, or the Aboriginal experiment in intellectual endeavor, was really unique in human history. And whereas in the West, we have taken it as a given, this notion of progress. You know, the one sort of motif of our entire philosophical tradition is improvement, change. You know, whether it's technological change, self-improvement through spiritual growth, physical modification of the body, from everything from diet to plastic surgery. We take it as a given that we can, and this goes back a long way. I mean, this is why when the British first washed ashore in Australia, they didn't just think that the Aboriginal people were strange, which they were to their eyes. There was something about the Aboriginal way of thinking that deeply offended the British. And that was largely because they were very, very evidently a people, a civilization that had no interest in progress, no interest in improving their lot, no notion of, and so the British looked at that and saw primitive technology, no ceramics, no wheel, certainly no written word, no agriculture, very limited material culture, and concluded from their point of view the obvious: these people were savages, no wonder they're so quote-unquote primitive. Well, of course, the British had no sensitivity to the subtlety of the Aboriginal mind, and there was a very clear reason why the Aboriginal civilization did not embrace the cult of progress, and that lies in one of the most elegant ideas ever brought into being by the human imagination, which is a dreaming. And whereas in the West we embrace progress, change, improvement, the entire logos of the dreaming is constancy, symmetry, balance, stasis. In other words, the purpose of humanity is not to improve upon their lot, but rather to engage in the ritual and ceremonial activities that by their very nature maintain the world exactly as it was at the time of the first dawning, when the ancestral beings walked the song lines and sang the universe into existence. And so what you see there is in a fascinating way, is the consequences. In other words, if humanity had followed that line of thought, if you will, we would not have put a man on the moon. But on the other hand, we wouldn't be talking about our capacity to destroy the biological life supports of the planet either. And I think that's a really important point, because, these cultures aren't just decorative. Culture is not decorative. It's not about feathers and bells or how you look or the songs you sing, even the prayers you utter. Culture is fundamentally about a set of values that you insulate the individual with, moral and ethical values, which by definition keep at bay the barbaric heart that history teaches us lies just beneath the surface of every human being. So culture in a sort of geopolitical sense is not trivial. It's what creates civilization. It keeps anarchy at bay. It's what allows us to sort of find order in a universe that may have none, to make sense out of sensation, to always reach for the better angels of our nature, however you want to put it. But in addition, cultural beliefs have consequences in terms of the ecological footprint. And again, it's not the measure of a culture is not simply the measure of what people do, but the quality of their aspirations. People always get this mixed up. They'll be confused why a people could presumably have an ideal that calls for a kind of a certain relationship to the earth, and then you'll see individuals in that culture clearly abuse that notion. Well, it's not really a contradiction. If someone came to me and said to me, what is the foundation of your worldview, I'd have to invoke the Judeo-Christian tradition. That doesn't mean I go to church every Sunday. So the measure of a culture is both what they do and what they aspire to do. But the bottom line is that cultural choices have real consequences. I was raised in the forests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the scientific forestry, which was less a science than an ideology, that suggested that these forests were decadent, overmature, all this language we use to rationalize their destruction in an economic system that had no place in its calculus for the value of those forests left intact. And yet that worldview that I grew up on, both in school, as a logger in the woods, as a student of forestry at the University of British Columbia, that made me a very different person with a very different relationship to those forests than someone from the west coast of Vancouver Island or the east coast, whatever, Nushalmouth or Kwakilth, who believed that, those same forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits that dwelt at the north end of the world, the very spirits that would be embraced during the Hametza initiation, such that the sort of wisdom of the wild would be brought back to the domicile in the potlatch, to the community, to the space. And of course, the interesting question is not whether those forests are the abode of spirits or whether they're simply cellulose and board feet. It's how the belief system, creates a different relationship to the earth. I mean, you went to the Coyariti, and Southern Peru exemplifies this. Their the notion that the earth is animate and alive is not a metaphor. People literally believe that the earth is alive, responsive to the human aspiration, even as a human destiny is wrapped up in a reciprocal relationship that implies obligations to the earth itself. So that every community in the Andes is dominated by a sacred mountain known as an apu. And as long as you're in the shadow of that apu, it will direct in some way your destiny. Now, this is not that esoteric a notion in a landscape in which the mountains quite literally create the weather, in an agricultural civilization and a set of communities in which hail can wipe out a crop in 15 minutes. And indeed, in the early 80s, there was an instance where, virtually, I don't know what it was, 40 or 50% of the maize crop of Cusco in the Sacred Valley was wiped out in a hailstorm. So this idea that the mountains are alive and there's an engagement with the mountains is both a poetic idea, but also a literal idea, in terms of the adaptation of the people. And so, a kid raised to believe that a mountain is an animate being that will direct in some way his or her destiny, again, is going to be a very different child with a different relationship to that place than a kid raised in Montana or in Alberta to believe that a mountain is simply a pile of rocks ready to be mined. We're going through this in British Columbia in a very interesting political campaign to save an area called the Sacred Headwaters as we speak. It's a remarkable accident of geography that three of British Columbia's most important salmon rivers, the Skeena, homeland to the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en, the Carrier, the Nast, homeland to the Nisga'a, and of course the Stikine, homeland to the Tahltan and the Tlingit. The headwaters of all three of those rivers, by this amazing kind of accident of geography, are born within walking distance of each other in this splendid set of meadows nestled into this rugged cluster of mountains near the Spatsizi Wilderness. And what's fascinating to me is the only place I know on earth where such an event happens is on the slopes of Kailash in Tibet, where the Ganges, the Indus, and the Brahmaputra all have their origins, or at least are perceived to have their origins. And Kailash is deemed to be so sacred that not only you're not allowed to climb it, you're not allowed to set foot on it. And the idea of imposing industrial infrastructure at the foot of Kailash would be so anathema to 2 to 3 billion people who live downstream on those river drainages, that to do so would be to condemn yourself and all your lineage for all time to the worst of fates. Whereas in Canada, by contrast, we actually, without even blinking, are considering imposing coal bed methane extraction in those very meadows, a particularly invasive technology which demands the injection into the earth of high velocity, high concentration, high pressured chemical soups that crack the anthracite coal and release the methane gas which is suspended in the coal seam, and it can imply the imposition of an incredibly dense concentration of wellheads. Unlike conventional oil and gas exploitation, coal bed methane can demand, at least a wellhead every 40 acres. So you're talking about, in the case of the Sacred Headwaters, a network of wells, as many as 5,000 to 6,000 wells, placed upon this extraordinary place. And in the Canadian sentiment, it's not even an issue. In other words, one of the things I find so interesting about this sort of issue is that, it says so much about who we are as a people. In other words, what does it really take to do such a thing? I mean, the mining industry is based on speculation. It's based on, a couple of characters in Toronto or in New York getting together, cobbling together these shadowy companies that have no more history than my dog. They can secure the rights to the land without even visiting it by simply going online. They have no experience in the country. They've never felt the pain of a winter or the promise of a spring. As all the First Nations say, this is your land, where are your stories? They have no stories. And even more dramatically and profoundly, the act of desecrating that landscape has no place in the spreadsheet. In other words, in the calculus of economic planning by our system, there is no obligation whatsoever for that enterprise to compensate the commons, which is the rest of us, for the cost of the destruction of the land that development entails. I mean, this is rather an extraordinary thing. All they have to do to satisfy the government to get the rights to desecrate a place that should indeed be the sacred headwaters of all Canadians is to guarantee a certain revenue flow through taxation or through royalties and a certain level of employment generated. Well, we shouldn't thank them for generating jobs per se. After all, without the workers and the labor, they can't get the materials out of the ground. Of course they're going to give some jobs to people. How many, for how long, on what terms, you know. And the royalty streams are so trivial that they really just amount to taxation into the provincial coffers, but there's never any royalties to the First Nations. There's never any payment to them to build up the infrastructure of their own lives. And it's a little bit like if I came into your garden and you're selling roses, you know, and I cut a deal with you. I'd buy all your roses, $1 a piece. You get rid of all your roses, and then as I'm walking out, I say, by the way, the act of me taking these roses from your garden, you know, the bouquet of 50 red roses, I'm going to destroy your house. And you say, wait a minute, that wasn't part of our deal. I mean, what about the compensate? Oh, no, I don't compensate for the destruction of the house. Hey, be grateful. I'm buying all your roses. And you know, we take that as a kind of a given, but it's very anomalous, that idea that the earth itself, left as it is, or the cost to the commons of its destruction, should have no place in the calculus of economic planning. It's bizarre.
It's too bizarre to really wrap our heads around. So maybe I can ask you, as an anthropologist, here's a species that has been around, we reckon, for 200,000 years.
Probably less.
Plus or minus.
Probably 150,000.
150,000. With this incredible diversity of ways of appreciating a place in the universe, an ability to live on the earth in a sacred way, with a proper relationship to the earth. We have this massive bank of memories, of knowledge, of experience. How can a species allow that to be practically completely destroyed in the short space of 300 years?
Yeah.
Has got to be the biggest enigma, riddle in the entire bloody universe.
Yeah.
How could it have happened? How can we possibly try
You know,
and
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I had never thought too much about the descent of man until I went to look at the Upper Paleolithic art of France, and with a poet friend of mine, Clayton Eshelman. And it's quite interesting because you know, we know that we descended from our direct progenitor, Homo erectus, roughly 150,000 years ago. And for much of our history, we shared the stage with our sort of distant cousins, Neanderthal. And Neanderthal clearly had some spark of awareness. You know, they did make tools, they had ritual burial. But whether it was the development of language, increase in the size of the brain, or some other evolutionary catalyst, you know, our species, Homo sapiens, quickly left Neanderthal gasping for survival. And one of the most amazing things about contemplating the art, the fantastic art of the Upper Paleolithic, is that by the time Neanderthal disappeared from Europe, for example, about 27,000 years ago, our direct ancestors had already, and for more than 5,000 years, been slipping into the belly of the earth to execute that exquisite art. Now, when you go and visit the caves of Dordogne, and you see this Upper Paleolithic art, you know, it clearly has an aesthetic that is astonishing, and it speaks to something far deeper than hunting magic. You know, the technical achievement is remarkable. You know, the use of twisted perspective, the four pigments, the use of the curvature of the stone, the use of the balance between the form on the rock, interplayed and with multiple layers of forms sort of dancing together, all brought alive by the flicker of a tallow lamp, you know. And but what is really interesting is that art form existed as a single aesthetic for almost 15,000 years. In other words, when you look up on the walls, what are you seeing? Well, my friend Clayton had this great way of thinking about it. He said, if you accept the fact that our species at one point was of an animal nature by definition, and you accept that whether we like it or not, at some point we stop being of an animal nature. He viewed proto-shamanism as a kind of, not just a first religion, but as a process whereby we were trying to reconnect with our animal nature across a chasm that was somehow and for whatever reason unbridgeable. And he viewed the art not as sort of symbols of hunting magic, as some anthropologists have said, but really as sort of postcards of nostalgia, attempts to reconnect in some kind of metaphysical way to the animal nature of which we all once were a part. Now, what I thought was so fantastic about that idea and the poetry of it is that, if indeed these were postcards of nostalgia, ours was a very long farewell. Because for over 15,000 years, from Chauvet, which we can date to 33,000 years before the Christian era, to Lascaux, which is 17,000. I mean, that's 15,000 years. That's 3 times the chronological distance that separates us today from the building of the Great Pyramids in Egypt. For 15,000 years, we seem to share the same aesthetic yearning. And then, who knows what happened? We slipped off. The Neolithic Revolution, which brought us, the cult of the seed, the development of hierarchy, surplus, specialization, all the hallmarks of modern civilization. And from then on, and it hasn't been a very deep history. It's interesting. I mean, it's easy to say 300 years for industrial society, perhaps, but the Neolithic is only, 10,000 years ago. Well, that's not a whole lot of time, and in that time, clearly we developed the genius and the technology to transform the world around us. And I think part of the challenge and part of the hope is that, the one great event, the single seminal event of the 20th century in terms of its promise for subsequent millennia occurred on Christmas Eve of 1968, when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon and emerged to see for the first time in human history not a sunrise or a moonrise, but an earthrise. And suddenly we saw, in this way that's been seared into our subconscious, that the Earth was a finite place. As the astronaut said, a blue planet floating in the velvet void of space. And that, had a far more important impact on human intellectual thought than certainly the Copernican revolution of the 16th century that showed us that we were no longer the center of the universe. Because from space you see this fragile planet. And, that veil of atmosphere is so thin. One of the most extraordinary things, I've been to Everest several times, and people always talk about in high altitude climbing of the death zone, that place where you can get where the level of oxygen is so low that you cannot breathe. Now, you've experienced it in a minor way at the Coyotiti, 16,000 feet. You get up into 27,000, 28,000 feet, and the oxygen is literally, a quarter what it is at sea level. But what is that really telling you? It's telling you that there's a place on the planet where you can wake up in the morning, have your coffee, have some breakfast, put on your boots, and walk virtually in a single day vertically into a place where you cannot breathe. Now, if that doesn't tell you about the fragility of this thin veil of atmosphere that insulates and creates the possibilities for life on Earth, I don't know what else does. And I think that is the great hope, because I think that we've seen an incredibly profound shift in the last 40 years. It couldn't have come too soon. But if you think about it, the last 40 years has seen such a profound shift in attitudes and perspectives. Not only in a sociological sense have we seen sort of women go from the kitchen to the boardroom, and people of color go from, the woodshed to the country club, and gay people from the closet to the altar. We've also seen, this idea of the environment just become part of the vernacular school children. I mean, 40 years ago when we were kids, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was a great victory. No one spoke of the ozone, or no one spoke of biodiversity, no one spoke of climate change or capacity to affect our own home. Now those notions are seared into the thoughts of children, and this represents a shift in attitude that is both incredibly remarkable in its speed and profound in its hopefulness.
How hopeful though? How deeply is it seared? Is it seared deeply enough for people to actually feel and experience the world as so many of the native peoples that you've lived with? I mean, that's deep. That's seared.
Well, no, I think.
Sounds like singed.
Well, I think I think one thing that's happening is that the separation between us and them, the idea that there's the Western world and there's the indigenous people. I mean, there is no us and them anymore. It's all about human beings on this planet, and I've spent all my time seeking visions of worlds that lie outside of my own. That's why I became so intrigued in anthropology. But I also don't have any romantic preconceptions of I mean, the fascinating thing about human beings really is, and again, this is one of the great revelations of anthropology, is that all human beings face the same adaptive imperatives. I mean, all people have kids, all people have to feed their children and educate their children, all people find rules to bring together man and woman to procreate. The rules may be different, but the adherence to the rules is universal. All people deal with the inexorable mystery that death represents and the spirit realm that lies beyond death. And that shouldn't really surprise us, because, again, the revelation of anthropology and genetics in particular is that we all are truly brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the sense of hippie ethnography. I mean, quite literally, we're cut from the same genetic cloth. The studies of the human genome leave little doubt that all of humanity is likely to have descended from roughly 1,000 people who walked out of Africa some 60,000 years ago. Now, if you accept that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, two important things come out of that. One is it finally puts a spike into the chest of the old canard that there's a trajectory of progress in the affairs of culture, that there's somehow a linear progression of movement, a ladder to success that invariably placed Victorian England at the apex of the ladder, of the pyramid that sloped down to the so-called primitives of the world. I mean, it's this idea, which was at the foundation of social Darwinian thought, remained very, very strong up until 20 years ago. And then the second important thing to come out of that is that if we are all cut from the same genetic cloth, it means by definition all human cultures essentially share the same raw intellectual capacity and genius. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise to an anthropologist, but at a time when less than 100 years ago or 100 years ago, Australian government was still debating whether Aboriginal people were human. And a time when in children's textbooks in Australia in the 1960s, a treasury of fauna of. Is that going to screw you up? That phone? Should we shut the doors? Maybe. Well, you want to just shut the door? Cool. We could even unplug the phone actually. Well, just it's recent. A treasury of fauna of Australia listed the Aboriginal people as animals. But when you accept the fact that we share that same raw intellectual potential, it means that how we use that potential is simply a matter of choice and orientation. We in the West have focused on technological wizardry, which has achieved great things. I mean, believe me, if you walk out of this house and you get in a car accident and you tear your arm off, you don't want to be taken to an herbalist. The success of allopathic medicine is one of the great achievements of humanity. I agree. Yeah. But, it's not like the other people have been intellectually idle. I made a film about Buddhism in Nepal, Tibetan Buddhism, and we call it the science of the mind. Why did we use the word science? What is science but the pursuit of the truth? What is Buddhism but 2,500 years of empirical observation as to the nature of mind. You know, as Mathieu Ricard, who was in the film, this wonderful,
he was great.
Just wonderful, you know, man, you know, former molecular biologist at the Pasteur Institute, raised in an illustrious family in France. His father, a philosopher who famously wrote a 2-volume history of Western philosophy from memory. You know, he grew up in a household that had Stravinsky, Lévi-Strauss, Cartier-Bresson as house guests, and he realized there was no correlation between achievement, fame, money, and happiness. And so he left his scientific career and he became an ordained monk. But as he famously said to us, you know, he quoted a Tibetan monk who said to him, you know, we in Tibet don't really believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do. In other words, these other cultures have just made different choices. And those choices, you know, had consequences. And so, you know, how these voices are going to continue to be heard in this changing world is hard to know. I mean, one of the clear backdrops to our age, and something that only really is becoming sort of part of the public awareness in the last decade or so, is that half the cultures of the world are slipping away in a generation. I mean, quite literally, we know this from the data on language loss. You know, when you and I were born, there were roughly 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Today, half of those aren't being taught to children, which means that they're effectively on the road to extinction. Which means, by definition, since a language encodes not just its grammar and vocabulary, but an entire vision of life itself, by definition, it means that, you know, half of humanity's intellectual, social, and spiritual options, you know, developed by definition over millennia, are literally disappearing in a generation. I mean, this is something that should be causing us all to be, you know, jumping up and screaming, you know. And the reason we're not screaming is that we still live under this conceit that these peoples, quaint and colorful though they may be, have very little to offer the modern world. By their very adaptation, they've shown that they can't get on the wave of history, you know. I mean, and nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, by definition, all of these voices of humanity have contributions to make, you know, important contributions, you know, and the question that doesn't become like, you know, the traditional versus the modern, but what kind of world do we all want to live in? You know, how do we find ways that all peoples can enjoy the benefits of modernity, technological benefits, scientific benefits, whatever, without that engagement having to imply the death of who they are as a people, you know?
Yeah, but can they all enjoy it? I mean, the demographics, the amount of people, the streaming forth of people from the jungles into Lima in search of that, and the hopelessness of it all when it actually comes down. There's not enough to go around.
I think that's a really important point. Is that I think the greatest flaw of our development paradigm, which, you know, is that we export this idea that we call globalization or free trade or free market capitalism, whatever you call it. It's kind of based on the assumption that it's not what it in fact is, which is just a model of economic activity that we developed in the West. It's exported as if it's the inexorable wave of history, and you either better get on the wave or you'll be swept away. But at its root, I think, is a fundamental lie. And that lie is the idea that if you give up your tradition, if you buy into this wave, into this paradigm, that you'll somehow magically achieve the wealth that we in the West enjoy. And the problem with that is that, as you say, there isn't enough to go around. At least in terms of oil consumption alone, it would take 4 planet Earths to get the world's population up to our level of material consumption. And what seems to happen is that people, you know, may be drawn to the magnetic allure of the modern, which is hard to resist, and God knows maybe any job in a city is better than back-breaking labor in the hot, sunny sun of the tropicals, you know, in the tropical field somewhere. But the move to the city, and of course last year for the first time in human history, more of us lived in cities than lived in the countryside. the move to the city just seems to me to bring disappointment, at least too often. All the indices of the development paradigm, and I'm not one to say what someone should or should not do. I still live by the adage that anyone who thinks they can save the world is both wrong and dangerous. But you do have an obligation to bear witness to the world, and it seems to me that this Western development paradigm, the indices of it don't say a whole lot about quality of life. I mean, life expectancy goes up by 10 years, but doesn't say anything about the quality of life lived longer. Infant mortality drops, life expectancy goes up, but it doesn't say how people manage to survive. Per capita income quadruples. It may mean that you've moved from an agrarian, cashless society into a sweatshop, where by definition you're making 17 cents an hour sewing baseball caps for Yankee Stadium, but your cash income's quadrupled. Even something like literacy doesn't necessarily hold its promise, because too often it comes as a package, that effectively, creates cadre for the economic system of the West. In other words, I've seen this a lot in places like northern Kenya, where nomadic people, as a survival strategy in a climate in which drought is a regular feature of climate, not some kind of cruel anomaly, people will try to get a child, and generally it's an eldest son, educated so that they can have, and literate, so they can have a foot in the cash economy of the modern nation state of Kenya, which is fine. But the problem is, too often these kids go to these schools that are parochial schools, and so they don't just learn literacy, they're also taught to have contempt for who they are and who their parents are, because nomadic people don't fit into the veneer or the idea of a modern nation state. And so the kids come into school as nomads, learn a modicum of literacy, graduate as clerks, and then can't go back because they've taught to be ashamed of their folks, and they can't go forward, or at least going forward means drifting to Nairobi to scratch a living from the edges of a cash economy. A cash economy, a modern economy of Kenya that has a 60% unemployment rate for kids. So, you see this. I mean, I did this film with this wonderful woman, Carol Black, on, the one sort of sacred cow of the development paradigm that even its fiercest critics have never been prepared to go after, is literacy. But, and who can argue with the right of a child to become literate? But at the same time, it's amazing how often it just becomes, in effect, a socialization process that tears people from their traditions and lays them out as fodder for the corporate system.
True.
I remember seeing in this film, there's a great scene where the film crew in Nepal, no, it was in Ladakh, just randomly went into the school. And you had this vista of these incredibly bored kids that she cut very cleverly back and forth with equally bored kids in high schools in the United States. And they're listening to this teacher lecturing them in English, which was not their first language, even their second language. It was not her first language or second language. Behind them was a window that opened up to this stunning Himalayan vista. And the subject being taught was botany. And here was this teacher struggling with the word xerophytic, trying to get the kids to memorize the word xerophytic. Xerophytic is just a term in botany that means a plant that grows in a dry habitat. Every desert plant is a xerophytic plant. But I mean, what the hell was that all about? I mean, all those kids, if they went and asked their grandmothers, could learn more about botany. I mean, hundreds of plants used in the mountains by all the folk traditions, and yet there they were plugged into these desks in this school, learning by rote this completely meaningless concept to them, xerophytic, which she couldn't pronounce, they couldn't understand, she didn't really understand what it meant, and if she did, she certainly, you could see from her face that she didn't understand why on earth she should be teaching that, except it was the bourgeois thing that the curriculum written in Delhi, inspired by London, bought from New York, is somehow saying that kids in Ladakh should learn. And it makes no sense whatsoever.
We're learning about things rather than from things, which is kind of
But it's not just learning about things as opposed to from things. It's also learning about things through the filter of a completely foreign ideology, which has been imposed on your people from afar, at one point through colonialism, now through an economic system that is not explicitly colonial, but in many ways,
Well, it
has the
requires literacy.
same. It requires literacy, but it also requires labor. And I mean, this is why when people speak of the great miracle of China, I don't get it. 400 million people without potable water, people living, and working in sweatshops under a tyrannical regime. If that's the future, I don't want to be part of it.
I don't want to be part of it either. Yeah, I think this literacy issue is really important, and not many people are bringing it up. Because everybody, like you said, it's a sacred cow. It's like, we won't go there. We won't go to the place.
And I'm not saying anything against literacy, but the fact that part of what an anthropologist or writer has a sort of luxury of doing is just sort of pointing out a few things. And one of the things that's so interesting is that whereas we celebrate the origin of writing, and it certainly has benefited us enormously, it is also dulling the mind, because it is by definition a shorthand that allows you not to remember. And when you think of stories of how the folk orators of the Inca, for example, would be able to recite, with the assistance of a quipu and the coca leaves in their mouths, these incredible narratives of history from memory, or I've always found it very interesting in non-written traditions how people seem to have almost a dialogue with the natural world, and in the same way that when you read a novel, you can hear the voices of the characters in your head. I've been with many people, whether it's nomadic Panan in the forests of Borneo or even Athabascan hunters and gatherers in Canada, who seem to almost have a dialogue with the natural world, whereby the animals and themselves were, had this sort of conversation. It was not particularly profound. It was not something that people spoke about, but it was never sort of forgotten. And so that the curse of scripted nature became a kind of vocabulary written on the wind. I've seen this just so strongly. And of course, that's something that we, by definition, give up when we use the shorthand of writing. So, God knows I'm not.
You're doing a lot of writing.
I'm doing a lot of writing, and I certainly benefited from the knowledge accumulated in books.
But you are allowed to point things out. The idea of saving the world is in a sense absurd. But you are out there on the front line, and you're talking about ethnocide, which is an important issue. I don't know how relevant that is now, but a couple of years ago when I was reading your material, ethnocide was really big.
Well, it still is. I mean, I think the genocide, the physical extermination of a people, is universally condemned. But ethnocide, which in a sense is the destruction, either directly or indirectly, of a people's way of life, is not only not condemned in many circles; it's still promoted as development policy. And again, none of us in anthropology would be suggesting, freezing people in time, like some kind of biological specimen, making zoological parks of the imagination. There's this, change is no threat to culture. All cultures have always been dancing with new possibilities for life. And technology is no threat to culture. I mean, the internet, in fact, is a tremendously liberating tool. It's become the kind of global campfire for empowerment. And I always said, that Lakota Sioux didn't stop being Sioux when they gave up the bow and arrow in favor of the rifle any more than American or Canadian farmers stopped being Canadian or American when they gave up the horse and buggy in favor of the automobile. It's so important that, we have this idea that these cultures are delicate or fragile, destined to fade away, and it's simply not true. They're not threatened by change. They're not threatened by technology. They're threatened by power. In every case, these are dynamic, living, independent peoples who are being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that, as I've written, is actually an optimistic observation, because it suggests if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. if this process is somehow coming out of the natural world, there's nothing we can do about it. But that's not the case. And so we have choices. And the choices isn't to freeze people in time, it's to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? How do we create a truly multicultural, pluralistic world in which we can benefit from the collective experience and knowledge of all peoples?
Which is what you're doing. You're bringing that information to people's attention. Tell me about the response you've been getting to the idea of ethnocide.
Well, it's what I don't, when I speak or when I write or I make films, I don't stay away from politics in any way, shape, or form. But I also don't indulge in the moment as an opportunity to share polemics. I think polemics are never persuasive, and in the same sense that politicians rarely are free to lead us anywhere. But storytellers can change the world, and so I try to, as a storyteller, I try to celebrate as opposed to lament, and by putting out the information, or better said, turning the lens on the situation in perhaps a novel way, or what I've found is that the response is astonishing. I mean, for example, I will go, as I have, the range of audiences that I speak to is astonishing. Like I just came back from Australia. I went right to Sun Valley to speak to a group of investment bankers who are basically the ones who are making these kind of serious choices. They so respond to this set of ideas. I once was giving a lecture at SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, and the Tate Lecture Series. And I spoke of these themes. I spoke of shamanism. I spoke of different visions of life, all the stuff that I write about. I didn't mince a word or hold anything back. I get a call at 11 o'clock that night from the president of SMU asking me, there's one of his friends wants to speak to me. It's Mr. Ray Hunt, who personally owns the biggest privately held oil company in the world.
Wow. And
he calls me on the phone, and he said to me with this wonderful Texas voice, he's a wonderful man actually, Wade, I got something going in Peru, and my name's on this company, and my son's name's on this company, and I want to do it right. And what he was talking about was a $4 billion or $3 billion investment in Peru in establishing a liquefied natural gas terminal. The pipeline already existed. The gas was going to be exported. And he said, he sort of said in a very almost warm way, I didn't really understand everything you said, but I just think you can help me. and I was blown away by that. I mean, here I was. And frankly, the Hunt family were, as much as anyone, the family that raised the money that allowed President Bush to become the president. On paper, there should have been every reason for me to disagree with them politically. And yet when that man said, my name's on the company and I want to do it right, he knew that I wasn't someone who could be bought off. But I met with him, and I was really impressed by his sincerity. And so I called up all my friends in Peru on every level of the society that I could reach, from the president's office down to the village level. And I said, first of all, will this project go ahead? The answer was universally yes. It's the biggest foreign investment in the history of our country. I said, do you want it to go ahead? I didn't get a single person who said no. And so my attitude was, well, this is going to happen. What can I do to help make it work best? And so at the invitation of the Hunt family, I contacted Tom Lovejoy, who's a legendary environmentalist, almost was the head of the Smithsonian, heads the Heinz Foundation for Teresa Heinz right now, is on the board of WWF, is probably one of the greatest Amazonian conservationists of the century, literally. And with Malcolm Gillis, who was a former president of Rice University, we formed this informal little advisory group that we laid down a rule: none of us would get paid. That if they wanted to give us a per diem, all that money, which is sort of standard when you know if you're going to go to Peru for a trip, you'll get a day. All that money is given away to environmental causes, or to, in my cases, you know, indigenous peoples who are trying to do something with it. Not a huge amount of money. We don't do a huge amount of work, but to me, you know, a lot of my friends will say, "How could you possibly work in any way, shape, or form for an oil company?" As my friend Tom Lovejoy said, you know, what on earth is the point of having a reputation if you're not prepared to spend it?
Yeah.
And
good one, yeah.
you know, and it's not like we're going to change the fate of Peru, and it's not like the world needs more natural gas, but it does, at least in the short term. And the question is, how can we help make this project work? So those kind of interactions where, you know, you're taking this message, esoteric as it may appear, and you go and you speak to I once spoke to 4,000 grade 4s in Minneapolis in this bizarre kind of thing put together by a big shopping mall where they worked with the school district to literally bring all the grade 4s and practically in the city, it seemed, you know, in 2 different lots to hear this talk. You know, you go and you know, I speak to everybody from, you know, the range of audiences that I've tried to bring this, I wouldn't even say message, set of ideas to, really ranges from, you know, I once, you know, kindergarten kids to, I once spoke to virtually the entire Supreme Court of Canada, United States, and England. You know, you know, and you know, and you get a response that is so positive. You know, and what I love about it is the response is that, you know, all my lecture agents tell me, you know, slow down. You know, don't use such complicated language. You know, and I never do it. I never. You know, obviously I'm not going to deliberately speak over the heads of kids, but, you know, I don't really modify my language, my delivery, the sophistication of the ideas, even for the youngest kids, because people don't need to be talked down to. They need to be lifted up to new levels and of thought, of insight. And what I've found, at least, you know, anecdotally and experientially, is that everybody is ready. Because people want to hear a hopeful message, that it's A, not too late, that B, these people are, diverse peoples of the world, are part of the human fabric and contributors to that fabric. And I always, you know, I lecture as I write, and I write as I lecture, and the way I construct any story, you know, as you've seen in my library, you know, a huge amount of research. But what I'll do is I'll go through all that research. You know, I mean, I'll read. I recently did a book on the water issues in the American Southwest, and really about the Grand Canyon of Colorado, as part of a sort of companion book for this 3D IMAX film that I did with my daughter and Bobby Kennedy and his daughter. And you know, to write what was essentially a 35,000 word essay, I read 60 books. You know. And what I do is I'll go through the literature, and I'll go through my own journals and my own notes, and I always pick out what I sort of think of as wow points. Like, you know, if some statistic inspires me or makes me say, wow, incredible, I know it's going to do it to the audience. So if I, you know, hear Story Musgrave talk about floating in the velvet void of space as the first physician to walk in space, and when I remember him telling me that there, you know, how he was there essentially in perpetual free fall, traveling whatever it was, 18,000 kilometers an hour, you know, the golden visor of his helmet illuminated by a single sight, a blue planet floating in the velvet void of space. And then when he said to experience that sight, a sight only made possible by the brilliance of human technology, and then to remember the callous way in which we treat our only home, was to know the purest sensation of horror. That's a line you don't forget.
Yeah, that's a line you don't forget.
And so what I try to do in my prose and I'm writing, and certainly in all the talks that I give, and even the films that we make, is to keep the narrative, you know, driven by points of inspiration and wonder, with the very democratic sense that if these ideas give us pause, as filmmakers or as writers, as editors, they're going to equally give pause to anybody with an open heart and an open mind, and that's certainly been my experience.
the recent experience with the Aborigines, to return to it, they don't seem to have any idea of time, you mentioned, no word for time. Therefore, they have no concept of evolution, of a progression through stages. And I remember a lecture of Krishnamurti in 1975 in San Francisco, when some guy asked him a very intellectual question, and it wasn't clear what the question was, and he threw up his arms in despair and said, "No capiche, what are you really asking?" And finally the guy got his question, which was, does progress always involve violence? And Krishnamurti, is that all you ask? Well, the word progress, its root meaning is to enter into the enemy camp fully armed.
I didn't know that.
Of course it means violence.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're seeing now that the whole idea of progress is intimately related to violence. But progress and evolution are not necessarily linked here. What I'm getting at is that there are people who believe that we may be at an evolutionary threshold as a species. It may be more than ethnocide, it may be actually the suicide of the species itself in an attempt to birth something else, who knows. But what is your view as an anthropologist of this whole issue of, is evolution a progression of a species towards a higher level of consciousness, or have we always had access to that level of consciousness like the Aborigines, and we don't have to go anywhere? We don't have to.
Well, I think most evolutionary biologists would dismiss the idea that that evolution reflects linear progression.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what the whole point of evolutionary theory is that obviously species respond to mutations occur that have phenotypic expressions that are either favored or unfavored by natural selection, and that the outcome is much more random in a sense than progression, the term progression would imply. And in fact, the evolution and progress have been used interchangeably, and I think that's totally wrong.
Totally wrong.
That said, there are clearly quantum leaps in evolution that occur in response to environmental pressures and the pressures of natural selection, and or the stimulation that is then acted upon by natural selection. And it's hard to imagine that, and this is a bit of a leap here, but given the extent to which human beings have succeeded in evolutionary terms based on their consciousness and based on our minds, it's hard to imagine that evolution couldn't be in some way working its way out through mental and spiritual kind of, well, not even spiritual, just sort of through consciousness. I mean, there's something about consciousness, whatever that means, that got us to where we are in both positive and negative ways. And I guess what I'm really trying to say, it's something about consciousness that's either going to bring us to a serious point of imperiling ourselves and imperiling the planet, or it's consciousness that's going to get us out of this mess. And I tend to feel that pessimism is a kind of an indulgence. And so if you're going to be alive, and I try to live by a kind of almost like a Hippocratic oath of life itself, where you may not have the conceit, you shouldn't have the conceit that you can change the world, and that wonderful phrase of Peter Matthewson's, anyone who thinks they can is both wrong and dangerous. And he obviously had Mao and Hitler and Stalin in mind. I mean these three men all thought they had the monopoly on the route to truth and the right set of ideas for their people, and look what happened. But I do think that if consciousness got us into this place, consciousness is going to have to get us out of it. And my optimism comes from the fact that I have lived through such changes, and I've I found myself when I think of how I've been able to grow from the narrow constraints of a very simple bourgeois upbringing, through education, through experience, to operate in a stage, on a stage beyond all my imaginings when I was a kid. It leaves me kind of, optimistic, and it's not like if I could come up with these ideas or change my mind, anyone can. I mean, I'm not trying to impose my ideas per se, but I mean, tremendously positive things have happened. I mean, even in the midst of very negative things. And
what kind of negatives then?
Well, I mean, obviously the revelation that we are indeed changing the biochemistry of the atmosphere. I mean, one of the things I find so astonishing is how some of these, because the society is, because the society is remarkably illiterate in terms of science. I mean, why don't we just finish that?
Yeah.
Gail, do you want to come? Because we're going to change tapes.
Yeah, we're going to change tapes.
Oh, Tara's on the phone. Oh, I've got to take this to my daughter.
Yeah, fine. That's a good place to pause.
Apart from people like yourself, almost nobody knows anything about it. So, what would you say is their message to us today, right now? I mean, if you were their bridge to bring us their message, what is it for our world?
I think the message is the same message you tell your kids. I mean, don't soil your own sandbox. Stop destroying the rivers. Stop polluting the seas. I mean, it's so incredible. I was doing a film on Polynesian navigation, and we were in the most remote reaches of the Marquesas, which is probably as remote as any place you can go in Polynesia. And, here we were walking through a landscape of ancient, monumental architecture, pristine beaches, where in the Marquesas there's not a major international airport, there are virtually no hotels, and yet the beaches were just utterly littered with garbage, plastic. You have these islands of waste floating out in the ocean that are like little countries of garbage. You have areas at the mouth of rivers that are dead zones. You just wonder how people can be so short-sighted. And I go back to this idea that the most frightening quality of our species is the fluidity of our memory and our capacity to forget. This was probably an adaptive trait when we were social species on the Serengeti plain. Now it can become our downfall. In other words, I remember, for example, I did a lot of work in Haiti, and Haiti in the 1920s was still virtually 60, 70, 80% covered with one of the richest neotropical dryland forests in the Antilles. Now the forest covers about 2%. And I was looking out over this sort of valley of scabrous second growth trees, and this voodoo priest I was with began to wax eloquent as if words alone could squeeze something beautiful, from that sight. And he could only think of angels, I could only think of locusts. He did more honor to the human spirit, I was more accurate in terms of science. And what I realized is that, the people of Haiti, within a single generation, they just adapted to a landscape that is virtually without soil, without trees, and that will never again know the comfort of shade. And, not long after that, I went on a kind of a pilgrimage, by inadvertent pilgrimage, when I was doing a lecture tour, and I visited 2 universities that allowed me to go to 2 of the great kind of sites of ecological tragedy in this country, in North America. And one was a patch of woodland on the banks of the Green River in Ohio, which was the site of the last great nesting flock of passenger pigeons. Now, people your age, my age, don't remember that, in the late 19th century, passenger pigeons made up 40% of all birds in North America. Flocks were so abundant that Audubon described what he estimated to be 2 and 3 billion birds forming clouds that eclipse the sun over Cincinnati. From the height of when flocks like that would land on woodlands, trees would break open from the weight of birds. Summer landscapes became winter landscapes with the amount of guano. And from the height of those populations to their final extinction was a generation. And it's because pigeon meat was a mainstay of the American diet. Gentlemen hunting clubs or shooting clubs in New York would catapult as many as 50,000 live pigeons to their death until diminishing supplies forced us in skeet shooting to use clay pigeons. The term in English, a stool pigeon, derives from a killing technique of the era. You'd capture a bird, sew its eyelids shut, tie it to a pole, put the pole on the ground, and its cries would attract the other birds that could be batted out of the sky with poles. And then I went from there to a patch of tall grass prairie in Iowa, where a young botanist took me through this tired field in the winter, and he was sort of focused on the plants. I could only think of the horizon and the physics of waves when buffalo used to move through this ecological formation, which once carpeted the central part of this continent from Manitoba south to Texas. And in 1871, buffalo outnumbered people in North America. You could stand on a bluff in the Dakotas and see herds that had areas the size of Rhode Island. They would take days to pass by a single spot. And from the height of the population of the buffalo to its final reduction to a zoological curiosity wasn't a century, and it did not come about as a consequence of the inexorable progression of the American frontier. It happened in 7 years. It was explicit policy of the U.S. cavalry after the Civil War to exterminate the buffalo and thus exterminate the Indians. And when Philip Sheridan, who led the campaign, the Civil War general, when the last of the buffalo was reduced to a curiosity, when the last of the Great Plains cultures were reduced to the reservations, he actually recommended to the U.S. Congress that a commemorative medal be minted that would have on one side of it a dead buffalo, on the other side a dead Indian. And this was the way of things in the lifetime of my great-grandfather. And for the people of Iowa, the time of the buffalo, let alone the time of the Great Plains cultures, is as distant to their lives and as irrelevant to their lives as the fall of Rome or the Battle of Troy. And yet it happened within the lifetime, in some cases, of their grandfathers and mothers, And this fluidity of memory, this capacity to forget, is really frightening. I mean, now the people of Iowa, famously good and decent people, live in a landscape that is positively claustrophobic in its monotony. Cornfields with monocrops of maize, horizons punctuated by silos. I mean, there's nothing natural, and yet it's so recent. So this is where our species, it's the weakest and the strongest part of our species adaptation. And in a way, I think what's happened is that, what is weird is that, evolution happens at a very slow pace, but the technological wizardry unleashed by our species is consuming the world at a tremendous pace. So the only thing that's going to, and it's also given us great gifts, but the only thing that's going to curtail this hell-bent for destruction path that we clearly are on at some level is if we can use our intelligence and intellectual ingenuity to shift this current of history. Evolution won't have time to do it. We'll have to think our way out of this problem. And the great optimistic thing is the old saying that the Stone Age didn't end when you ran out of stones. The oil age isn't going to end when we run out of hydrocarbons. The great hope for the world, and truly the great hope for America, is the only thing that can continue to spark the imagination of this country in a way that will allow it to continue to be a legitimate leader in the world, and that's the greening of the economy. No other country is as equipped as the United States, despite the recent economic meltdown. It still has the ingenuity, the culture of risk-taking, the resources, and the capacity to lead the way in the greening of the world's economy. If Bush, at 9/11, instead of clearly fueling the flames of fear by declaring war on abstraction, terrorism, if he instead had stood up on the rubble of the World Trade Center and said, "This is never going to happen again. I will never again let a commodity with an unnaturally high value dominate our world. We will not allow a bunch of klepto dictators from the Middle East just because they happen to be born in sands. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We will never allow this to happen again. We will not I'm not deluding you. We're not going to become fully energy independent, but we will reduce every year, reduce our capacity, increase our capabilities in terms of alternative energies, with the goal of reaching the moon in a decade. We did it once before. We've got a kind of new moon to reach. If we had done that, think of how different this decade would have been. There would have been no Iraq war. There would have been no, if anything, the price of oil would have declined. The economy would have grown with the incredible investment into the greening. I mean, if we do greening the economy, just think about it. It's going to make the IT revolution look trivial. I mean, every part of our infrastructure is going to have to change, and that's what's going to allow this country to reassert itself, because that level of ingenuity, of freedom of thinking, is something that I do not think the Chinese, for example, have culturally and politically.
Which is why you're here.
Which is why I live in the States. You live in the States because it's the best of all things and the worst of all things, but it's the States.
Yes.
It's an amazing place.
So
what we need to do is make this a country of Walt Whitman and the Grateful Dead again.
So unless that happens, unless we get into that paradigm again, we have a new greening of the economy. Do you feel that the ancient prophecies of the Mayans and whoever else have substance? Do you feel that there's something?
Well, one of the things I'm very careful about is, I so respect the integrity of cultures that, I never, if what I say about cultures is even half true, these aren't ideas or beliefs that you can try on like a cloak. In other words, people have always said to me, like, particularly because of the voodoo books, well, did you become possessed? Well, if they knew anything about me, they would know that I would never become possessed. Not only out of respect for the traditions, but because I think so. I so believe that spirit possession is real, but it can only be real if and it's so complicated in terms of the psychological, physiological elements. It's something that has to be in the fiber of your being. You can't just try it on like a cloak. And by the same token, I don't believe in universal. I believe in universal messages. I don't believe in universal kind of predictors like prophecy. Like I don't even know what that Mayan prophecy really is about. I mean, you remember we had that whole thing, the world, and people are given to megalomaniacal kind of fantasies. I mean, we even did it with the Y2K thing at the turn of the century, and what was it? The Mayan. There was that big Mayan thing that was supposed to happen. I kind of think they're kind of the products of people on too many drugs, to be honest with you. I mean, it's sort of like the thing about the plants and Mozart. The richness and the complexity of the human condition and the human beliefs and the human spirit cannot be readily reduced to kind of, pan-continental hippie ideas. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. But that doesn't mean I'm not being dismissive of people who find solace in such ideas. But I don't really believe in universal fantasies, or I don't believe in universal possibilities. I mean, the whole richness is that what the Maya believed was a product of the Maya, and stays with the Maya, and we don't even know who the Maya really were. I mean, hell, until 20 years ago, we thought what it was called classic Maya, Tikal, for example, Chichen Itza, was the height of Mayan worldview. Now it's pretty well clear from excavations at places like Mirador by Richard Hansen, and that probably the height of the Maya era was 1,000 years before the time of Christ. I mean, when we can't even settle on that, let alone having any understanding of how they disappeared, how on earth can we project notions of a Mayan prophecy that's just been drawn from the ether by some well-intentioned... the terrible thing about the New Age movement is its credo is, if I believe it, it's true, and becomes profoundly kind of anti-intellectual. And it's obviously a movement that, especially in its heyday, was a reactionary movement. It was a reaction against the excessive Descartesian, deterministic, positivist lineage of the 19th century, you know, where we're all, you know, where I mean, this is really where the West really, I think, took a descent from the Enlightenment, because the positivist tradition was really when we began to say, if phenomena can't be measured and observed, they can't exist, you know. So all notions of metaphor, magic, mysticism that had in various ways propelled the human species for most of our history were kind of tossed out, you know, and we didn't realize that you know, that faith, for example, or belief in spirit or God or whatever, it didn't matter whether it was true or not. It was a blanket of comfort that gave solace to people in a very troubling universe. And so, you know, when we threw out all openness to faith, magic, mysticism, we also gave up, you know, the comfort of certainty and the comfort of understanding, and in a way cast ourselves adrift in what became the kind of hallmark of modernity, which is the isolation of the individual, sociologically, spiritually, even politically, and often economically, you know. And this is one of the, it's not even a crisis of modernity, it's a condition of modernity, you know, which again is not particularly normal in the affairs of human beings. I mean, it's not really normal to live 3,000 miles from your parents and move 1,500 miles before you bother to tell them. You know, we do it all the time.
All the time.
Good.
Thank you. Let's have
bet.
a couple of shots outside and we're